I worked as a babysitter for several years of my life when I was a teenager. Although many impressive things happened to me worth telling, none were like what happened at Paco's house, whom I regularly cared for 2 years, until he went to live with his grandmother. Shortly after that night. His dad was on a trip and his mom had gone out with her friends, so I was going to stay with him until the next morning. This was arranged so that I wouldn't have to go home late at night. Besides, it paid better when it was like this. It was 11 o'clock at night. Paco had been asleep for over 2 hours. I was reading silently in the living room when I heard a sigh, a long, heavy sigh that filled the whole house. I got up to check. For a moment, I thought it was an open window. A gas leak. I don't know. Something that could have made a sound like that. When I got up, little footsteps running down the long hallway that crossed the huge house alerted me. It was Paco, who had woken up. He was crying. He had had a nightmare, a horrible dream. He described to me where he saw a woman floating through the house from corner to corner, through the ceilings where she hid in the darkness, to float back to another corner, to the other end of the room. What he said scared me, of course. Being in a house of that size, almost everything was in darkness. But in the end, it was just a dream. A child's nightmare. He tried to sleep and I tried to return to my reading. Paco shouted at me again. He wouldn't stop shouting at me. I thought he had fallen, that he had broken an arm or something because the screams were desperate. I ran into his room, and he was still frantic under his blankets. I uncovered him and checked him, but he wouldn't calm down. He was telling me something between sobs, but I couldn't understand him. I shook him very badly. I remember asking him to calm down and tell me slowly what was happening. He pointed behind me to the ceiling and told me that the woman was there, that it wasn't a dream, that when he saw her, he started screaming. And then, the specter opened the door and left like that, floating, stuck to the ceiling, in a strange way, as if dragging herself along it. Suddenly I got very scared because I remembered that indeed, the door was open when I entered the room. I stayed with him and tried to calm him down, but eventually we forgot about the apparition. And that's because his father arrived. He had returned from his trip and looked terrible, as if he had been crying for hours. Paco's mom and her friends had had a car accident. A public transport truck crashed into them. They all died. I stayed for several days taking care of Paco, and we never mentioned again what he saw that night. After some time they moved to his grandmother's house so she could take care of Paco. But years later, one of my cousins also went to that first house to take care of a child. He told her that there was a woman who floated on the ceiling that scared him and his dad. But his mom couldn't see her, and that they were already looking for a new house. We had never experienced anything strange in that place until that day. It still disturbs me to think about her. When I was studying in Santiago, I babysat on weekends to help pay the bills. I can't say I enjoyed it, but I got along well with some of the children I spent time with. The one I loved the most was Elena, a beautiful blonde girl who was also the most sensitive person I know. I remember once I arrived, and her mom greeted me while helping to serve dinner. She invited me to dinner and told me that Elena was in her room, to ask her to come down. I went up, approached the door. Elena sounded like she was having a lot of fun with one of her friends, So without knocking to not disturb them, I asked them to come down for dinner. "We're coming," her friend answered me, and it caught my attention that when speaking to me, her tone and even her voice had changed, even sounding more adult. Then they started whispering to each other, and I, somewhat confused, went down. I noticed that there was a plate missing at the table to serve. I offered to go get it. The mom told me no, that there were enough, and I asked if Elena's friend wouldn't be joining us. "What friend?" she asked me, laughing. Elena came down and looked at me with a mocking smile, and I was dying of curiosity. When we finished dinner, in a moment of distraction, I went up to her room to check it. I couldn't even take a step inside when I noticed a doll, almost Elena's size, sitting facing the door. It was a very strange doll of her mom's, that almost always remained stored in a room of things they didn't use, and old furniture. It was the only time I saw it outside, and I never knew what it was that I heard. Elena swore to me that she wasn't talking to anyone that night, but every time she denied it, she did it with a big smile on her face. A while ago I heard a story on this channel that caught my attention because I had experienced something similar. I think the video is already somewhat old, but I just heard it in October. Well, it happened to me when I was helping in a house, and mostly taking care of the 2 children of a couple who were always working. Both the boy and the girl were very sickly, had multiple allergies, and had to be cared for at all times to eat, or at least get a little sun. They didn't get close to the windows at all, which was perhaps natural being on a 12th floor. As I gained their trust, they told me something they didn't dare tell their parents, who punished them every time they thought they were making up lies. "Sometimes a man comes to see us through the window," they said. "He touches it and talks to us." I asked them to describe him to me, but at that moment they didn't agree, so I asked them to draw him. They did it separately at the same time, but I was surprised that they then drew the same figure. The girl, very young, could barely draw a silhouette with a hat. But the boy also drew a figure with a small hat, like a magician's, but small. But on the entire face he had a huge mouth that covered everything. I kept going and didn't tell the parents. I thought the children had seen a horror movie, that some image had stayed in their heads and had started to inhabit their nightmares. Until once, in the middle of the afternoon, when the parents were working and the children were at school, I heard as if someone was trying to open a window. Obviously, it caused me a lot of strangeness, and then panic when remembering the children's stories. I ran to close the door of the room where it was heard. It was theirs. After a long time, almost hours, after having left and returned to the house, I gathered the courage to check. The window was still closed because it had a lock, but outside there were marks, very clear marks, of 2 hands, as if they had tried to open it. I used to take care of my cousin when she was just a baby. I practically lived at my grandparents' house, where my aunt and uncle also lived, to always take care of her when I got out of high school. My uncle suddenly did very well. He had some small food stands that had turned into 2 locations, and then into 4 small restaurants in Zapopan and Guadalajara. With a loan, they bought a huge house in the same neighborhood, somewhat old, abandoned, but it was a great investment if they managed to fix it up a little. Friends from the street teased them because they had bought the haunted house, as they called it, but in the end it was maybe also a bit of envy, I want to assume. But well, the neighbors were right. Many things happened and continue to happen, but I can only tell you about what I witnessed, although I only endured a few weeks there. From the inside, the house was much friendlier, less abandoned than it seemed from the outside. It had been sold to them by the bank. The lady who lived there had died without a will almost 10 years ago. But the truth is that this lady never left. I had never seen ghosts before. I mean, I believed, but as you believe in anything, trusting the stories of friends, of family. Now I doubt that any of those stories had been real. Because the truth is that when you see one, it changes you completely. It changes your life when you really see a spirit. From the first days in that house, we felt, let's say, a presence. Doors would close by themselves. Noises were heard in the kitchen when there was no one there. You know, the typical stuff. We even joked a little, thinking that maybe it wouldn't go beyond that. The grandmother who was helping us settle in didn't find it very funny, and after she heard something, she decided not to come back. The baby would have her own room for the first time. It was the first thing my aunt and I arranged. Afterwards, as soon as we finished, we would notice that it was an extremely cold room. Or at least, that's how it got for much of the day. That's where I saw her for the first time. I had gone down to heat up milk and covered the baby's crib with the mosquito net. The house was full of moths, so it was necessary to always use it when we left her, even if it was for a moment. When I came back behind the mosquito net, sitting in the chair where I had been a moment ago, there she was, the old lady, and I saw her as clearly as if she had been the most real of people. I ran to grab the baby, and without turning around, I went on with her running. When my uncle found me crying, he tried to convince me that it had all been my imagination, as always. Until that same night, he began to hear the tired footsteps of someone outside his room, as if someone was walking in a 1-meter circle, just approaching and moving away from the door. Luckily, that time the baby was sleeping with them. I tried to calm down and not think about it, but it was increasingly unbearable to work there. No matter how much I owed my aunt for all the help she gave me, it was impossible. I saw the woman 3 more times. Once when I was leaving very late at night. She was barely peeking through the window, looking outside. Another time, I'm almost sure, that thing was singing to the baby. I approached the bedroom because I heard a voice, and there it was, very close, behind the mosquito net, on the other end. The other one, the last one. There I saw her with all clarity in the kitchen. I saw her just as I turned on the light, and when I noticed that figure a few meters from me, all I did was lower my gaze, turn off the light and run out. I could swear the time I even felt her breath, rotten, very close to me. I have no idea if that thing is evil or not, but I do know that I couldn't continue doing my job. And according to my conversation, my aunt to this day, they continue to endure her presence in that house. Tales of the Night Community. Thank you very much for listening to this new compilation. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. I promise you won't regret it. We'll see you again at the beginning of each week, on Mondays. This was Tales of the Night.